animals have to be so complicated? Like, can someone explain that to me? Okay. So Pope Benedict the 15th, don't know why I could not think of that for some reason. Um, on December 7th, 1914, had begged an official truce to be between the warring governments, and he asked that the guns may fall silent at least upon the Knights of the Angels, where they were saying, and which was refused by both sides. Now, what about the fraternization? Well, there was peaceful and sometimes friendly interactions between the opposing forces, and this was a regular feature on the quiet sectors of the Western Front. Now, in some areas, both areas will refrain from aggressive behavior, while hello, welcome back to Down the Rabbit Hole. First off, I want to say Merry Christmas, and I've been waiting to put this episode out for a long time because Christmas is coming up, and I think it's important that we talk about an event that happened regarding Christmas and we can go down the rabbit hole and discuss. But anyway, if you're new here, hit that like button, ring that bell for notifications. Also, please subscribe because here on Down the Rabbit Hole, we talk about history, we talk about paranormal activity, urban legends, any topic we can just go down the rabbit hole and discuss. I am sitting on my bed, obviously, as you may be able to tell. I just don't want to go to work at my desk, and everything. So we're gonna be talking about. So with that being said, why don't I just dive into today's episode? Isn't that why you clicked on here after all? So today's episode is one of those days when history and Christmas coincide together. Now, back in 1914, World War One was happening all over the world, and Christmas came on both sides of the war, and was called and they were called an unofficial temporary ceasefire for 24 hours. Now, the truce did occur 5 months after hostilities had begun, and lulls occurred in the fighting, and armies ran out of men and ammunition. And commanders reconsidered their strategies following the statement of the race to the sea and the indecisive result of the First Battle of Europe. In the first week leading up to December 25th, the French, German, and British soldiers crossed their trenches to exchange seasonal greetings and talk. In some areas, men from both sides ventured into no man's land on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day to mingle and exchange food and souvenirs. Now, there were joint burial ceremonies for prisoner swaps as well. So, and while several meetings ended in caroling, hostilities continued in sort of some sectors, and while in others the sides settled on more than more than arrangements to recover the body. Now that following year, a few units arranged ceasefires, but the truces were not nearly as widespread as in 1914. This was in part due strongly to the orders from commanders prohibiting truces, and soldiers were no longer amenable to the truce by 1916, and the war had become increasingly bitter after the human losses suffered during the battles in 1915. So, the truces were not unique to the Christmas period and reflected a mood of live and let live. And there were infantry close together, would not stop fighting for fraternizing, engaging in conversation. And as I said, in some of these areas, there were some of the occasional ceasefires that would allow soldiers to go between the lines to recover the wounded and the dead comrades. In others, there was like a tactic agreement not to shoot while men were rested, exercise, or worked view of the enemy. The Christmas truces were particularly significant due to the number of men involved and the level of participation. Even in the quiet sectors, dozens of men openly congregating in the daylight was not remarkable and were often seen as a symbolic moment of peace and humanity amidst one of the most violent conflicts of human history. And that's crazy to think like this truce right here couldn't like it made history and like this is what I love about history. Like it's one of my things to talk about typically, but history teaches us so much stuff that we If we don't stop pay attention, because we're bound to repeat history, we really are. But let's talk. I want to go into a little bit of background about this. Now, let's go. Like during the first 8 weeks of World War One, French and British troops stopped the German attacks through Belgium into France outside Paris at the First Battle of Marne in the early September 1914. The Germans fell back to Iceland Valley, where they dug in the First Battle of Iceland. In the Franco-British attacks, were repulsed by both sides and digging trenches to economize on manpower and use their selfless to outflank. Now, to the north, their opponents. Now, in the race of the sea, the two sides were made reciprocal, outflanking many in several weeks, and during which the British forces were drawn from the ice and sent to the north to Flanders. Both sides ran out of room. And by November, armies had built continuous lines of trenches running from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier. Now, before Christmas 1914, there were several peace initiatives. The Open Christmas Letter was a public message to address peace to the women in Germany and Austria, signed by a group of 101 British women suffragists by the end of 1914. Pope Benedict of um I done forgot this number. It's Roman numerals, y'all, but yeah. Yeah, and why do Roman numerals have to be so complicated? Like, can someone explain that to me? Okay. So Pope Benedict the 15th, don't know why I could not think of that for some reason. Um, on December 7th, 1914, had begged an official truce to be between the warring governments, and he asked that the guns may fall silent at least upon the nights of the angels where they were saying, and which was refused by both sides. Now, what about the fraternization? Well, there was peaceful and sometimes friendly interactions between the opposing forces, and this was a regular feature on the quiet sectors of the Western Front. Now, in some areas, both areas will refrain from aggressive behavior, while in others, it extended to regular conversation or often visits from the trench to another. Now, on the Eastern Front, Fritz Kreisler reported incidents of spontaneous truces and fraternizing between the Austro-Hungarians and Russians in the first few weeks of the war. Now, truces between the British and German units can be dated to early November 1914. Around that time, the War of Maneuvera ended, and I apologize, I'm terrible with words and names, so please do it easy on me in the comments. While rations were brought out after the dusk, and soldiers on both sides noted that a period of peace while they collected their food. Now, by December 1st, a British soldier could record a friendly visit with a German sergeant one morning to see how they were getting along. Now, relationships between the French and the British units were generally more tense, but the same phenomenon began to emerge. In early December, a German surgeon recorded a regular half-hourly truce each evening to recover dead soldiers for burials, and during which the French and the German soldiers exchanged newspapers, and the behaviors was often challenged by officers. Now, Lieutenant Charles de Gaulle wrote on December 7th that the lamentable desire for the French infantrymen to leave the enemy in peace, while the commander of the 10th Army, Victor d'Orville, and those it just now, wrote the unfortunate consequences when men became familiar with neighbors opposite. Now, many other truces could be forced on both sides by bad weather, especially when the trenches lines flooded, and these often lasted after the weather had cleared and everything. Now, the proximity of the trench lines made it easy for the soldiers to shoot greetings from each other, and this may have been the most common method of arranging an informal truces in 1914. Um, Men were frequently exchanged news of greetings held by common language. Many German soldiers had lived in England, particularly London, and they were introduced with the language to society. Now, several British soldiers recorded instances of Germans and asking about news from the football leagues, while other conversations would be banal as discussions of the weather and plaintive as messages of a sweetheart. Now, one unusual phenomenon that grew intensely was music in the peaceful sectors, and it was not uncommon for units to sing that evening, sometimes deliberately with an eye of it toward entertaining or gently taunting the opposite numbers. Now, they shaded the gently into more festive activities in the early December. Sir Henry Hulse of the Scouts Guard wrote that he was planning to organize a concert party for Christmas Day, which would give the enemy every conceivable form of a song of harmony. In response to the frequent choruses in the Dutch land, other Uber allies. So, that brings us to Christmas 1914. And this was roughly about 100,000 British and German troops that were involved in the informal cessations of the hostility along the Western Front. And the Germans placed candles on their trenches and the Christmas trees and then continued the celebration by singing Christmas carols. The British responded by singing carols of their own. And the two sides continued by shouting Christmas greetings to each other. Soon, therefore, there were excursions across no man's land where small gifts were exchanged, such as food, tobacco, alcohol, and souvenirs, such as buttons and hats. Now, the artillery in the region fell silent, and the truce was allowed a breathing spell during which recently killed soldiers and could be brought back behind the lines of burial parties and joint services. In many sectors, the truce lasted through Christmas night, continuing until New Year's Day in others. Now, on Christmas Day, Brigadier General Walter Concrieve, commander of the 18th Infantry Brigade, he was stationed in Neuve Chapelle, um, and wrote a letter recalling that the Germans declared a truce for the day. One of his men bravely lifted his head until there was a parapet, and the others from both sides walked into no man's land. Officers and men shook hands in exchange for cigarettes and cigars. One of the captains s- smoked a cigar with the best shot of the German army. Now, the latter was no more than 18 years ago, with Congreve admitted that he was reluctant to witness, and General Sir Horace Smith Dorrien was the commander of the Second Corps and issued orders forbidding friendly communication with opposing German troops. Hitler was a corporal at the time. This is before he was the Nazi, so was literally a German emperor and stuff like that. So let's keep that in mind before he was basically a dictator. Um, Hitler was a corporal of the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry. And he was also an opponent of the truce. Of course he was, because it's Hitler, right? But anyway, in the communist sector of the front, there was early fraternizations between the German and French soldiers in December 1914. During a short truce, there is at least two other testimonials from French soldiers of similar behavior in the sectors of French companies who opposed each other. One generals, well, one person will write to his parents that the Boche waved the right flag and shouted, "Camarades, camarades, one day rendezvous." I think I'm pronouncing that right. Y'all, it's been forever since I took French. I barely remember any of it as it is now. But I think I know what rendezvous means. Anyway, I'm getting off track. But he would also go on to say that when we didn't move, they came toward us unarmed, led by an officer. And although he was not clean, they are disgusting clean. They are disgustingly 50. I'm telling you that this, but don't speak of it to anyone. Now, there was also some football matches that happened. And when I say football, I don't mean American football. I mean football as in Europe and most of the country. Um, Soccer, as you would for Americans, football for everyone else. What do other countries call football here? Like football here in the U.S. Like I'm very curious. Anybody knows that? Please let me know. But anyway, many accounts of this truce involve one or more football matches played in no man's land. And this was mentioned in some of the earliest reports with when a letter was written by a doctor and everything else. Now, the truth of the accounts have been disputed by historians, and in 1984, Malcolm Brown and Shirley Seaton concluded that there were probably attempts to play organized matches and that failed all ring to the state of ground. But this was a contemporary reports and everything else. Now, what about the Eastern Front? Well, on the Eastern Front, the first move from the Austro-Hungarian commanders at uncertain levels of the hierarchy um, of the military hacking, and the Russians responded positively and eventually met in no man's land. Now, what about the public awareness? Now, the truces were not reported for a week, and eventually being publicized to the masses when an unofficial press embargo was broken by the New York Times, published in neutral United States December 31st, and everything. Now, by January 8th, 1915, pictures have been made their way to the press and everything else. And coverage in Germany was less extensive than the British press. Now, we're probably thinking, was there later truces? The answer is yes. So, British and German troops burying the bodies of those killed were killed on the attack of December 18th. And after 1914, there were sporadic attempts for seasonal truces on the Western Front. For example, a German unit attempted to leave their trenches under a flag of truce in the Easter Sunday of 1915. That sounds like a fun episode to research. I've adding it to my list. Um, Now, but they were warned by a British opposite of them. In Easter 1915, on the Eastern Front, there was truces between the Orthodox troops and the opposing sides and everything. But in December in 1916 and 1917, German overtures to the British for truces were recorded without any success, and some French sectors singing in exchange of thrown gifts were occasionally recorded, though these simply may have been reflected as seasonal extension of live and let live approach in the trenches. And on May 24th, 1915, Australia and New Zealand Army Corps and the troops of the Ottoman Empire at the Gallipoli agreed to a 9-hour truce to retrieve and bury the dead, and during which the opposing troops were exchanged smiles and cigarettes. But what do y'all think of the Christmas truce in 1914? Like, I think it's very interesting, and I think it shows, and I think it's just something in history that we don't really talk about very often, and I think we should. Like I said, I'm a huge history nut. I love stuff like this. So I have many more battles coming for y'all, but I really wanted to get this episode out and going. Because this is important. History is important. And if we don't learn anything else from history, we need to remember that we need to pay attention to history because it's eventually going to repeat itself. And I know there's some of y'all out there who's like, I hate history, yada, 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 and all of this. Like, some people aren't history people. I get it. Some people, like, don't like learning about it. They like watching it and everything. And I get that as well. But if you're into this, I'm glad you watched it till the very end. I will see y'all next time. Y'all have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.